I was talking to the kids about Minecraft one day, and I said the first thing that made me feel like truly ancient. I was like, Minecraft, huh? When I started Minecraft, you had to download it off of Notch's personal website. You had to send a Swedish man $10.
I had this conversation with some children 2 weeks ago.
And then he just sent you the file.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
That's how it's just a website. Like, here's your $10. Here's your Minecraft, sir. And then, billions of dollars later. Those were the early days. When we used to do sound check at church, I would do tater talk, and I would just freestyle some stuff about potatoes. And it worked really well for our sound check, and it kept me from going check 1, 2, 3,
A, B, C, D.
I like to use the Jabberwock as my sound check.
Oh yeah,
was brillig in the slithy tove, the gyre and gimbal in the way. All mimsy were the borogoves, the momras out grabe.
I think he's
Beware of the Jabberwock.
Oh, goodness gracious.
Hi, everybody. My name is Evan.
And I'm Scott.
We are both Baptist pastors, and this is our podcast about the Bible. But hey, relax. We're not trying to save your souls. We will not be telling you what to believe or how to behave, and we promise never to invite you to church. We just like to talk about the Bible, what it actually says, where it probably came from, and how it's been understood, or not, by different people in different times and places. But this is your warning, especially if you are or have been a person of faith. For our purposes, the Bible is not a sacred text. During this podcast, we'll be treating the Bible more or less like any other book. We are pulling it down off the pulpit so that we can wrestle with it all night long. While you're here, there is nothing you have to believe. There are no beliefs you can't question, and there are no questions you can't ask. Welcome to the unHoly Bible Study Podcast. Hi, Scott.
How are you doing, Evan?
I'm doing fine. We're welcoming Josiah Black to the podcast today.
Yeah.
And we're really excited you could be here.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
You can't really delay the guest introduction in this format because they can see that you're
there's
here.
Another person in the room.
Yeah.
And
so,
who are they?
Yeah. So we really just have to start by telling them that until recently, Josiah was the pastor at First Baptist Church of Peru, Indiana.
That's right.
Yeah.
Although after this, maybe they'll take my picture off the wall.
I was going to say, people don't have to worry. They didn't kick you out. They
did not kick me
leave.
out. Yeah. I didn't do the big bad thing.
Yeah.
Which often is what happens when you introduce somebody as
until
recently.
Yes.
They were the pastor of here and there.
So rest assured, he chose to leave. Before that, you held various roles in higher education, including at Sioux Falls Seminary.
Yeah, so I was vice president at Sioux Falls Seminary for a couple years, and I also had kind of a parallel appointment at Taylor Seminary in Edmonton, Alberta. So those two places were sharing administration as institutions, and I kind of helped facilitate some of that. Yeah.
And currently, Josiah teaches adult basic education at Putnamville State Correctional Facility.
Yep. I teach, reading, language, and math.
You might also know him as one of the co-hosts of the Necessary podcast.
I assure you, you do not know me as that.
Which sadly
one
is
of our 12 people. Thank you for
no longer running.
No.
And I've known Josiah for years, since we worked together at church camp.
Yep. But one of the good ones.
Yeah, I like to think so.
Yeah.
And not just because we were there.
Which one is that?
We met at Green Lake Conference Center.
Okay.
We were on staff at the Quest. Technically, we didn't call it church camp. We called it youth conferences.
Youth conferences, or at that time, they might have even called it a leadership conference of some.
Yes, leadership development. We said that.
Yeah. It was a church.
We had air conditioning.
We did. That was
which
nice.
was nice.
Yeah,
did you go to church camp, Scott?
Not at Green Lake. Yeah, we
Well,
Yeah, ours were,
Other ones count.
were out in the boonies in West Virginia.
those are the kinds I went to as a child.
We used to have a group from West Virginia.
We
So
did.
That's probably a side story that isn't.
Yeah,
for
it
this.
doesn't.
Yeah.
It's not podcast
Yeah.
appropriate.
No, it's not podcast appropriate. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you like church camp? Did you ever work at church camp? That's a real
No,
good,
I never did.
on ramp to pastoring.
It is. Yeah, they get you hooked,
Yeah.
and then you just want to keep.
I
doing
do have a church camp story, real quick.
I was hoping you did.
No, so 1 year for church camp, somebody drove the church bus with all the kids on it, and then they just left the bus there. And then a different person was supposed to take us back, but the person that drove us there accidentally kept the key. And so because of my vast knowledge, I hotwired the bus for them.
Did you really?
I really
Wow.
did.
Was that your first hot wiring, or
No,
you'd
it
done it
wasn't.
before? Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. Congratulations.
Yeah. Oh, we all remember our first hot wiring. I think.
Can't
And
do
I
it
think
it's a
anymore.
story everybody has. Yeah.
We are so glad you're here, Josiah. Welcome
Thank you.
to our podcast about the Bible.
Yeah. Glad to be here.
I assume, given your background, that this is a book you've read before. But
The
would you-
Bible?
Yeah, the Bible.
Yes.
Would you tell us a little bit about your background with the Bible?
Mm-hmm.
I assumed, just because I know you, that you were raised reading this book, that you were taught things about it.
Yeah.
How has your relationship with the Bible evolved through the years?
Well, I have a
assuming it has.
It has. It has. Thank God, or whoever. I well, I was raised in a very fundamentalist context. Like they actually put fundamentalism on the sign.
That's another level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't like we're fundamentalists, but we don't say it because that word's not sexy. It was no, we're fundamentalists first. And they were also like hyper dispensationalists. So growing up, I really only heard Paul preached, like that very specific corridor within Scripture. And I know, I think I've listened to one of them. I think you mentioned being from a kind of a similar context.
Yeah.
And so this was not a Baptist context.
Right.
And so I had that very narrow perspective on the Bible growing up. I got into a Baptist youth group in high school and finally got to ask some questions about it. And I was allowed to read the rest of it, at that point. And things just sort of expanded from there. But so I've occupied probably just about every position on the spectrum, as far as from a hardcore fundamentalist perspective to someone who now these days probably reads it with what might be labeled a more progressive lens, who still sees it as being holy scripture, whatever that means, but important for life and practice in the Christian faith, but not necessarily with the same rigidity that I would have had growing up.
Sure.
Did
Does that
you
answer the question?
Did you accept that rigidity at the time you were in that church?
Oh, that's a great question. Less and less as I grew up. I famously, I think I've told Evan this story before, but I'll tell you. We, when I was in, I think it was middle school, they were doing a young Earth creation unit,
Sure.
which is a topic I have bucked against.
So
many
this
times.
is the idea that the universe,
yes,
or that the earth is
all of it. If
All
there's
of it.
more than,
Like-
if there is more than this construction,
Yeah.
it was all made about the same time, which was
5,000 years ago.
5 to 7, depending on who you talk to.
Yeah.
This has been a topic that has vexed me throughout. If you look at my church that I used to pastor, I have one negative Google review, and it's from a guy who wanted to debate me in the aisles of the church about young Earth creationism, and I politely declined, and he took that as being very dismissive. But so
1 star.
I know, right? It was still 2.5 because the people were nice. So
That's pretty good.
I'm an elitist, but the people were nice. Anyway, so when I was in middle school, they were doing a unit on young Earth creationism, and I asked a question. I said, "Well, what about the dinosaur bones?" Okay, now I recognize now the guy who was teaching our middle school youth group was an HVAC guy. Like this, he was, and he was a perfectly smart guy, right?
Yeah.
But he is not a biblical scholar. He had received no training or preparation for how to handle these questions and conversations. And so when I said, "What about the dinosaur bones?" he said, "Well, Satan buried them to trick us." And even in middle school, I was like, I don't know. I think you, an adult, just lied to me, a child. And so it was a lot of little tension points like that, and things that it was like, I don't know if that holds water.
Yeah.
And that's what led me into other spaces.
Now, we had at least a better explanation for the dinosaur bones.
Tell me about those.
It's the Great Flood. There
Very
was
dope.
so much sediment because of the Great Flood that's why they're buried way down and it appears millions and millions of years ago. But
sure.
And scientists don't know how to read it right.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if
carbon
only-
doesn't decay at a predictable rate.
Right,
so,
right.
Yeah.
Well, and water, right? Doesn't it mess with carbon? I
Oh,
don't
sure it
know.
does. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So was that process painful? The way you talk about it now, like even kind of this moment in middle school, it feels like it's raising questions, but it's not like generating a crisis of faith.
No, it didn't hurt, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so.
And I think because outside of that, I was always encouraged within my own home, at least, to be intellectually curious, to ask questions. And even when those questions made my parents uncomfortable, particularly my mom, who was really the more religious one, there wasn't a sense of, but don't ask, know? And I think because of that, I never internalized it as, you can't ask about this, you can't struggle with it, you can't wrestle with it. Or at least if they tried to make me, I never did it. So, it hasn't been a painful process. It's just been a growth process. But I've never been in a point where I was like grieving and feeling like I lost who God was because I had over related that to what I think about this book, you know, which I think is sometimes what creates that pain and that tension for folks. If this is God to you, then that's going to hurt, you know, but I don't think I had that experience.
Yeah. That feels really familiar to me because I grew up in really conservative communities and communities that professed these kind of beliefs about the Bible and what it was and how you were supposed to read it. But I think probably I would say something similar because I was always encouraged to ask questions because questions were taken seriously in my home.
Yeah.
Because I was around at least some adults who were willing to say, I don't know how the dinosaur bones got there. Like, that is a good question. And who knows? Like, it doesn't seem to align with what we've been taught or what the Bible says.
Oh, I was going to say, sorry, to be clear, we know, Evan. We know how the
but
dinosaur,
it was so
because
helpful.
it's real old. Okay.
I now don't. This is not a question I'm asking anymore.
Yeah.
I assume I know how how the dinosaur bones got there. But it was helpful that I was around adults who even if they might have questioned that the earth was that old, they recognized that there was a question there worth asking and some ambiguity worth exploring. Yeah. So.
My question was, if it takes millions of years for light from certain stars to reach Earth, how did that happen? And when God did it, he just went ahead and filled in the missing light.
Okay.
So they had good answers. Good answers is not right. They had thorough answers for every one of your questions.
Or they just you had a better improviser than the guy I got. It's what it's possible too. So yeah. I want to be clear too. He was a sweet guy, like genuinely a good guy, right? I know this was just an adult who got caught off guard by a question he did not understand, but did not want to, in his mind, destabilize everything they were trying to build for me faith-wise.
Yeah.
So let me just shoot from the hip.
I kind of like Satan buried them to trick us.
Yeah.
Because I have also heard, and I'm not making this up, I have heard the explanation. God buried them
To test
to
us?
give us something to do.
Oh.
Like when they when they hide peanut
like
butter
an Easter
in the
egg.
bear's cage at the zoo. It's enrichment. It's like,
So it's like a jobs program, right, for archaeologists?
Yeah. I'm going to bury
And Kelly-
these.
they'll find these. They'll be so confused.
Someday there'll be a man named Steven Spielberg. And he's going to see these things and he's going to make this wild
And
movie.
it's gonna be all worth
be
it.
So sick. Yeah. That's very good.
So,
I loved later in life when this wasn't like a moment that caused me to reevaluate, you know. I loved the image of Satan, who, if you believe he exists, we certainly don't ascribe omnipresence or omnipotence to him. So I love the idea
This
of this
is how
guy just
Satan-
with a shovel.
running around.
I'm the Dark Lord of the Air. Let me
Well,
bury these bones.
he had to dig pretty darn deep
Yeah,
in some
yeah.
cases.
I mean,
It's
that's
a rock.
That's
Yeah.
commitment.
But if you're digging from underneath, hell, it's a lot.
That's a good
That's
point. Yeah,
a good point.
I guess
Yeah.
he just affixed them to the ceiling
Uh-huh.
at that point. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, thank you for asking. I think that started with the question of what my relationship
It
with the
did.
Bible was.
Thank you for.
It's a heck of a cool book, though.
You like it?
Mostly, I like it. I love cultural relics.
Uh-huh.
And setting aside its relevance today, but the story it tells about the people in the time that it was written and existed, like it is a remarkably, not even complete, I would say, but we don't have very many books like it
that's
that
true.
shine such a clear light on a particular people at a particular time. The fact that it got attached to three major world religions, really, and therefore has survived the number of centuries it survived. Yeah. I know there's probably a tendency to ascribe divine intervention on that, sure, but just that it exists.
Yeah, we really don't have many objects like this.
We don't. It's pretty unique in that way.
I think that was one of the impulses behind creating this podcast was just our recognition that this is an incredible piece of our cultural inheritance and something worth talking about apart from its relevance to people of faith. Yeah. Are we ready to start talking about Genesis?
Sure.
Okay. We are going back to the book of Genesis today. This was actually the first book we talked about on this podcast when we looked at the creation story in Genesis 1. But today we are talking about an entirely different kind of story from much later in the book. And we thought first it might be helpful to have just a little bit of background information about it. The book of Genesis is the very first book in both the Christian and the Jewish scriptures. So this is how the Bible begins for Christians. It can be divided roughly into 2 or maybe 3 major sections, although all of the stories it tells are related. The first 10-ish chapters of Genesis are sometimes known as the primeval history. Those chapters tell stories that seem to come from the very dawn of time. And they're some of the most familiar stories in the Bible, stories about the creation of the world, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah's Ark, the Tower of Babel. Maybe these are stories you've heard before. All of those stories come fairly quickly, and then the focus of the book narrows down. The rest of the book of Genesis tells the story of Abraham and Sarah and their family. Abraham and Sarah are usually thought of as the founding figures of Judaism. And in the book of Genesis, we're told how God chose Abraham and promised that their family would become a great nation. And then over the next 40 chapters, we see those promises playing out, although not always exactly the way we might expect. Genesis includes stories of 4 generations of Abraham and Sarah's families. We hear about their son Isaac and his sons Esau and Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. And the book of Genesis then concludes with a long, elaborate narrative about Jacob's son Joseph, who becomes a powerful figure in the court of the Egyptian Pharaoh and saves his family from starvation. But we're not quite to that part of the story yet. Today, we're reading a story about Joseph's father, Abraham's grandson, Jacob. Now, Jacob has always been a bit of a dick. The story goes that he was born literally holding on to the heel of his twin brother Esau, presumably trying to slow Esau down so he could be born first. Later, we're told that he convinces Esau to sell his birthright for a bowl of soup. Now, to be fair, that's on Esau too. But then Jacob conspires with his mother to manipulate and deceive his blind, aging father in order to steal a blessing that was intended for Esau as well. At that point, Jacob needs to get out of town, so he goes to live with his relatives. He's gone for many years. He gets married. He amasses a fair amount of wealth, as we'll see. And then eventually God tells Jacob to go back home. He does, but he's a little bit worried as he travels about what will happen when he meets Esau. Is Esau still angry, even after all these years? And that's where we pick up the story today. Genesis is a weird book. It's a very old book. Some of the stories in it are almost certainly among the oldest stuff in the Bible. Scholars believe that it was pieced together over hundreds of years by different writers and editors who were collecting and refining stories and traditions and maybe even some other written materials as well. It is often confusing, sometimes quite upsetting, and almost always a fascinating glimpse toward the origins of Jewish and Christian faith. What do you guys think? Are you into Genesis?
I love Genesis.
Why?
Because it frustrates me.
Uh-huh.
But, when I read it and try to come up with some kind of coherent application to my today experience, I'm less excited. Right. There are some obvious problems that arrive. But as a picture of a culture making sense of itself, as a picture of a people codifying the things that set them apart from the other people around them and how they want to tell their story and why they exist and what their relationship with their God is like, it's fascinating. Yeah. Again, we don't have very many pieces of literature like this. Human beings have a way of sanding down their past and grabbing onto whatever's in the now. And so this exists as a coherent cultural narrative. It's exciting. It's interesting. I like it.
Scott, how do you feel about Genesis?
I like it. I think for me, like going back to the first Genesis episode we did, there are theological themes that I think aren't obvious just at a general reading, but for like when we talked about the creation, the fact that the God of Israel created in a nonviolent way. Mm-hmm. So, and it's very likely the very first nonviolent creation story. We talked about that. So there are things going on, the Abraham and Isaac, where Abraham was going to sacrifice. There's some things there, and I hope we get to do that one later. But I see that as an anti-violent story, actually often not read that way. So to me, there are these nuggets that I think are often hidden or not obvious, and I love to like shine the light on those.
Yeah. We've talked already about the creation story and the way that gets talked about, especially in some conservative evangelical circles. What about the narratives, the stories from Genesis, kind of the patriarch stories about Abraham and Sarah, their family? Did you hear those stories growing up? How were they applied? What did you make of those, or what did you hear about those stories? Did that question make any sense?
So the main thing for me in Genesis that I was obsessed with was Methuselah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, yeah.
How'd he get so old?
Mm-hmm. Very old.
Yeah, that was a big one for me. I love to ask every Sunday school teacher, like, how did that happen? But it was because of the atmosphere, because that was all before the Great Flood, and so there was more oxygen in the atmosphere. There were reasons.
Your people were so creative.
Mm-hmm. But then the
very impressed
the
by
Great Flood changed the global climate so much that people couldn't live as long.
Can you imagine an education program so effective that you could get people to remember details that specific about the Bible?
Yeah.
I don't know how they did that.
It's because that's because the air was better.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
It's a marvel.
Because the air was better.
Yeah, it's bad. I want to be clear.
Yeah,
I was also always fascinated with Enoch, and he was no more.
Yeah. That's a good one. That begs the right. It's a one-off. It's these little things. Where did it come from? What did it mean? And all those sorts of things.
What about you?
What about Evan? What about you?
It's a good question. I think. I very clearly remember Sunday school lessons about the binding of Isaac, the near sacrifice of Isaac. I remember hearing these stories about Jacob and Esau, certainly about Abraham. I don't think my Sunday school teachers were trying to apply that many lessons from them, or like the lessons would have always just been trust God, obey God,
maybe
do what God says.
Do what He says.
Yeah. But beyond that, I was older before I started to realize like these people are not good. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of moral ambiguity. The text itself doesn't even try to hold up a lot of these figures as moral paragons. And I think they were the heroes of the Bible. These were heroes of the faith. And because they obeyed God,
Yeah.
trusted God.
That's a very unique thing about the Bible, that it doesn't clean up the character defects of its of the people
At
in
least
there.
in some places.
I mean, a lot of other cultures, everybody is dressed up, cleaned up, but
yeah. And this is
Well,
one
if
of the
you-
things scholars notice about Genesis, especially. This is one of the ways they trace the different authors, the idea that these narratives have been stitched together from different sources. And one of the things they look for is the way the characters are treated. Are the characters treated like moral paragons? Like, are they presented as great and noble figures, or do they feel like human beings who make a lot of mistakes and some stupid decisions?
Because when you're a culture, how you write something, it is reflected in what you intend to do with it, right? If we imagine Genesis as this pastiche of things that were brought together, probably from oral traditions, and they were brought together to be used within their culture to talk about themselves, and not as a performative piece for other people around necessarily, right?
Yeah.
Then you put it together with the assumption that if something needs to be made sense of, there's going to be somebody around to make sense of it.
Yeah.
We're not collecting or putting this together to do that work, because there's always going to be the old man or the old woman at the fire telling the tale or reading the tale who can fill in those details and tell you whether Abraham or Isaac was good. It's become problematic in our application of it because we don't have those people and those filters from that time. We've created our own to make sense of it. And that's where we sometimes get into trouble when we try to interpret this book.
So in the story we're reading today, Jacob ends up, we'll talk more about it, but Jacob wrestles through the night with a mysterious figure. And one of the things Jacob wants out of this encounter is a blessing.
Eventually, at least.
Yeah, we don't know why it starts.
We don't.
By the end, Jacob is asking for a blessing. And before we take a break, I wanted to talk about that word. And what do you hear when you hear the word blessing? What does that word mean to you? And how do you think you get a blessing from God?
The etymology of the Hebrew word for blessing, barakah, the earliest uses of that word, it literally meant to squat. And it was, I've probably told this in another podcast, but it's associated with women giving birth. They squatted to give birth. So then this word associated with giving birth becomes the word for blessing. And to me, that's saying it's something that's life-giving, that has this powerful effect.
Do you think of yourself as blessed?
That's a deeply personal question. It's yeah.
Sorry.
I think I want to think of myself that way, but I can look back and see how it's also something I felt like I've been missing somehow.
Yeah.
Because of the way I'm wired, I never really fit as a traditional pastor. And there wasn't somebody to say it's okay to be a pastor this way, some kind of a blessing. There's always the weird family dynamics. I think this captures that. There's sometimes there is a favored child. I don't feel like we had that in our family, but yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
So parents, I think, can really have a huge influence,
Is a blessing also a responsibility?
I don't know. Do you think so?
I think it is. I think in this context, I think it's you are the one who will carry the whatever it is forward in some degree, right? Like the blessing is not just, and now you're going to win every contest you get into, it's not like luck, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's some sense of you are the one who will carry whatever this is forward. I think in the case of this particular book, it's this idea of God is doing something with these people. And while we don't yet know the full details of it, we understand from our ancestor that he has made some kind of promise, and it's going to extend forward into the future through someone. And who is going to be the person that bears that out? You're going to be the person. And we can read that as, oh, you're going to be the person. We can also read it as, you've got to be the person. And I think that changes what the experience of blessing can be. So is blessing purpose? I don't know. Is that part of it? I don't think it's just riches and success, right? Which I think sometimes in the modern parlance, that's how we would use it. If I'm blessed, I've got all the stuff I need. I feel good about things, right? I think there's maybe a comedy podcast where they introduce it as too blessed to be stressed, too anointed to be disappointed. Like that's and I don't think it's that necessarily. I think it's a mantle as much as it is a present. So I don't think Jacob knew what he was stealing, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah, that's a good take.
Don't think he knew what he was stealing.
Well, it's odd that he even feels like he needs to get this blessing because he's already he got the one from his dad, but he's actually already been promised.
He wants blessings. He's multiple.
He's already been promised what he's asked for, right?
Yeah.
Like
he's a striver. He wants more, right?
He's a blessing collector.
I just, I'm sure we'll get into it later, but I love the idea of two sweaty dudes. Like one's got the other in a headlock and he's got his arm around the other guy's leg. It's like, bless me, I want your blessing. And this other guy's like, oh, I won't tell you my name. Like there's so much stuff. Well, I know we'll get into it.
And who would have thought God's a fan of mixed martial arts, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
or pro wrestling.
Right,
I think it's the better choice here, right? Was it a heel turn or a face turn?
Well, and you should have seen God's championship belt.
Oh, I mean, it was gilded.
They called it a breastplate, actually.
He wore it. They wore it subsequent generations. Yeah.
Excellent. I don't blessing is not, it's not part of my normal everyday vocabulary.
No.
But I like the idea of being blessed. Like I think if I use that word, I'm probably thinking that I think close to the heart of my personal theology, whatever it is the idea that life in and of itself is an incredible gift. And to be blessed means to get to live a life. I love the idea.
It's to affirm your life is sacred. There's something sacred about every life.
Holy and good. That doesn't necessarily mean easy or always pleasant. And I think probably there's a side of my theology that says everyone's blessed, everyone's cursed with some of the same ways, and those overlap in awkward ways.
And that responsibility associated with the blessing. Think about Abraham. God blesses Abraham. Why? So Abraham can be a blessing to all nations. So there is a reason for it. It's not just
unless they curse him.
So right, except for the ones that aren't. Right, No, here's a question about blessing. Right? Did Jacob even steal anything? Did Esau even lose anything, or have they just misunderstood the point?
Yeah.
And do we misunderstand the point when we imagine it as a thing that can actually be taken?
Well, it is just like you were saying. It's a hilarious image.
Yeah.
And surely that's not lost on whoever told this story originally, is you can't wrestle a blessing out of someone. Or maybe you can, but that's not how we...
But what does it even
mean? It's very strange to imagine someone holding on. I will not let go unless it's a threat.
And can you imagine the people telling the stories around the campfire? And I mean, they're going to elaborate. They're going to expand the story, and there's going to be some pretty funny storytellers, and they're just going to, paint a vivid picture of God and Jacob wrestling blow by blow.
All night.
I have no doubt that we got the most tame shorthand version of this story. And that what they did with this for centuries around campfires and in Babylon and so on and so forth must have been something to see.
Cool.
I would like to know what they were wearing. That's,
the wrestlers or the storytellers?
No, the wrestlers.
There's only one answer to that. We'll have to get to it after.
Yeah, I think
There was only one proper way to wrestle in the old world. You know?
Well, now, what kind of oil were they using?
Yeah.
Also a question we could ask. Well, it seems like we're ready to get into it. So let's take a quick break, and then we will dive in. And we are back.
Hey.
So we have all three read the 32nd chapter of the book of Genesis in preparation for today's conversation. And we're going to start with Take It or Leave It, which is a game we like to play. Josiah, are you familiar with this game?
Yeah, that's why I'm here today, is because when you explained the premise, I was like, I wouldn't do a podcast unless I get to decide if parts of the Bible get a stay or go.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm out. I'm into it. I'm ready.
Then you should go first.
Oh, I should go first?
Scott goes first.
Oh,
Scott always
okay.
goes first.
This is what
The
I'm
guest
going to
doesn't
keep.
have to go first. Sorry. You're
This
going to
is
keep
what
it?
I'm going to keep. And one of the main reasons is the whole God not revealing his name to Jacob. That's an important story for me.
Cool. Josiah?
I'd keep it. I'd keep this one. I'd keep most of Genesis. But this one in particular, because I think it's a really wonderful example, and we'll get into this a little later, but of how sometimes stories exist to explain certain cultural practices.
Sure.
Doesn't mean they're not true. They might not be, but it should definitely stay. How about you, Evan?
I'm a keep it. This is a keep it for me. I think the whole Bible should be stories like this.
Yeah.
It
would be a lot
these
better if it
weird
was.
little stories. Very confusing.
And then
very
we
hard to
wrestled.
explain. No, this is my favorite. There's almost nothing in this chapter that I don't like. So, yeah, that's a keep it for me.
Yeah.
It's unanimous. This one can stay.
Yeah, good.
There you go. Good job, Genesis.
I think everybody who currently has a Bible on the market just breathed a sigh of relief that they don't have to do revisions. Yeah.
What do you want to talk about? Where should we go first?
Where to start with this one? Okay, so what I love about this, and the reason that, in a sense, I'm going to start at the end. Okay, is that all right? Is that acceptable
We
in our
can go
format here?
anywhere.
Okay, that's
We
what I
used to,
thought.
when we started, we tried to go through it like a verse or a section at a time,
Yeah.
and it was just boring.
Sounds very boring. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff at the start. Don't get me wrong.
We'll come back to it.
But I find the wrestling match particularly compelling. But the thing that I think is so interesting about this is the very last verse of this whole thing, which is, therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. All right. Now, why do I care about that? Because this is considered part of maintaining and keeping kosher for modern Jews too.
Right.
They keep this up, right?
A rule. So this rule is still followed?
It is, I believe so. It's still followed. Yeah, absolutely. And not only is it still followed, it's also one of the few, if not the only, dietary restriction that comes from anywhere but Deuteronomy and other parts of the code, where eating stuff, Deuteronomy and Leviticus, where the instructions for eating are outlined. This isn't repeated there. It just exists here.
Yeah.
Which I think is very, very interesting.
Yeah.
And to me, when you see a story like this in the cultural milieu of a people, the story probably exists to explain that practice. And even if that demystifies it a little bit, we need a good way to explain to kids why we don't eat this muscle. And I think that's why this story exists, or at least why it's told in the way that it's told, why Jacob's hip got dislocated. Now, did he also wrestle God? Okay, sure, we can get into that, right? Yeah. But I think that last verse,
that's the point of the story, right?
This exists, and I find that so interesting. If you ask, this is why. It's because he wrestled God.
Yeah. Genesis has a couple stories like this where they're the word scholars use is etiological. Yeah. They exist just to explain a practice or the name of a place or how things came to be the way they are. And Genesis, more than any other book in the Bible, has several stories where they end with, and that's why such and such, or that's why we call it this, or we do things that way.
There is one other dietary law that comes from Genesis, and it's from the Noah story. You have to kill the animal you're eating. You can't just cut off a limb, put a tourniquet on, because you don't have refrigerators, So you get down to an animal with no legs left, and you have to kill it.
A much darker spin on. Would you like to buy half a cow? Just imagine God being like, I should probably tell him.
Yeah.
Don't stop doing that.
Do that.
It is a genius solution to preserving meat, though. Isn't it?
Ugh.
Yep.
I
Yeah.
don't like to think about that.
No, but yeah. So that's I find that fascinating, right?
It is fascinating.
And so many stories and cultures exist to explain why we do a certain thing or to tell us something about who we are. And in this particular case, this is just a beautiful example of that.
Yeah.
And so at least that element was added for the purpose of explaining, I think, why we do this.
Yeah. So the story is kind of that, and we can move back toward the beginning as we go. But Jacob has sent everybody else away. He's traveling with his family and all his livestock and his servants and all this stuff. He sent everybody away, and then he has this wrestling match that lasts all night long with an unnamed figure. I think it's a man.
It's a man.
It says it's a man.
Ish. It's a man
that appears, and they start wrestling. There's no dialogue. One of the really famous explanations, or what's the right word? One of the famous interpretations of this passage is that it probably originated not just as like the story about why we don't eat the hip socket, but as a legend about Jacob wrestling a river demon.
I've seen this.
It's I can't remember which scholar. I believe a German scholar from the 19th century said it's like the contours of a folk legend are here. Rivers are places often associated, like it's a ford, it's a place where people are crossing the water. Those are
place of
guarded
transition
by demons or spirits
or
and
trolls.
That's what,
or trolls. Yeah.
trolls occasionally. Yeah. And that's what Jacob is wrestling. I remember hearing that interpretation, or maybe reading it early on in seminary, thinking, "Oh, this story just got so much cooler."
That'd be way cooler.
Yeah,
yeah.
But
they use the word "ish" though, like for
that
a
it's
man.
a man.
Yeah.
Scott, that what do you like here?
It's
what's interesting
that God won't tell Jacob his name. Although God doesn't say, I won't tell you. He just asks, why do you want to know? And it's dropped right there.
So you think Jacob is wrestling with God?
I was going to ask the
Let's
same thing.
talk about that.
You're sold on he's wrestling God.
Well, it's not unusual for God to be anthropomorphized or portrayed as a actual physical being. I mean, it's the Garden of Eden. God's walking around, hanging out with Adam and Eve. So it's not inconsistent with Genesis.
That's true.
So it makes sense that this could be an anthropomorphized version.
I don't know that I'd say it makes sense.
It makes sense that Genesis would portray. It doesn't make but
So you think it's God Jacob is wrestling with, and like they're wrestling all night, and then Jacob is asking for a blessing, and he asks.
I think the assumption of this chapter is that it's God. Because
at least in the final version,
because what did I do here? I wrestled with God and survived, right?
Saw God.
But it's the name thing that's key for me, because I think for Jews that's like so important. God really doesn't have a name, really. Even the name God tells Moses is not really a name. And that's important to me, because what it's really getting at is you can't objectify and define God if you don't know God's name, right? There's a sense that in naming something, you are exerting some authority or control over that thing you've named.
I've placed it in a box.
Yeah, and so the unnamed God is also a God who can have some universal it can be relevant to other cultures, right? Because the name's not tied up in that culture. So I think there are some deep theological ways to read that as well.
Yeah. And it's not just, the question about names is not just the stranger's name, right? Or God's name. I almost wonder if the fact that the stranger won't reveal his name is why Jacob believes it's God.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that God doesn't have a name, anyone else would have just told me.
Yeah.
But the name conversation actually starts with the stranger asking Jacob, "What's your name?" And Jacob says Jacob, and then he gets a new name, right? Which is also a really significant moment in the story of the people of Israel, because and I'll read it. It's so. The stranger says, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." Jacob says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, actually, it's not totally clear who's saying what to who. "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." So that's, a lot of people have read that as saying you're striving with God right now. That's the identification of the stranger with God. I'm not convinced that I mean, this could just be more general. Like, Jacob's been striving with God and humans from the day he was born. That's his whole deal. And again, we're in the realm of etiology, explaining things. Jacob, some people say the name Jacob literally means he grasps at the heel. Like, that's how it's explained. In, maybe in the Bible itself. And Israel means struggles with God, right?
It would be interesting to know how the Talmud would view this. Is this God or not?
Well, there's different interpretations. And I've not read all of them. I think it's fascinating. So the philosophical rabbis like Philo says this is an angel. It's not God, because you can't wrestle with God. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Yeah. So there's a strand in Jewish theology that has all the same questions anyone else would have, and comes down to the conclusion that no, this is an angel, it's a messenger from God, or it's some other version of all those pieces together. I have no idea what more modern.
In my church, this was Jesus.
Yeah,
I've heard this too.
Yeah, let's talk about this.
Oof.
Yeah,
that one.
How does that work?
So that vexes me. But, I don't know. So you go ahead with.
Well, I mean, the only physical manifestation of God was Jesus, right? God in the flesh. So it has to be Jesus. If it's God, then it's got to be Jesus, not God the Father, or not the Holy Spirit. It's as proof. It's a proof text.
A proof text for what? What is it proving?
That Jesus was God. That Jesus is the incarnation of God, because
this is possible.
Jesus has been hanging around incarnated forever and shows up here and there. And
I've heard same thing in this one. I've heard in the fiery furnace, right? I've heard that.
That's Jesus.
Christ was in there.
The oaks at Mamre. That's Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. That's the only.
He also is in one of the post-credit scenes on one of the Marvel movies. I can't remember which one it is, but he shows up all over the place. No, that bugged me, because I heard the same things growing up. Because our incarnation was singular, and everybody who interacted with it, as seemingly in the New Testament, it was like a what? You know what I mean? Like God and man, like this is a new idea.
Yeah.
It was not this strain. There was no expectation in Jewish theology that there would be incarnate God. Yeah. And so the idea that, and then Jesus was there the whole time, like,
Christians knew something that Jews didn't, right?
And that's the part that
the Jews were confused.
Right? It's, we're going to go back and tell you how to read your scripture.
But there is an idea that this might be God. Like,
I disagree, but
So, all right, we'll get to it. So early Christians, this is not just whoever was preaching in your churches. Like, this is patristic theology. Like, many of the early Christian writers use this as proof of the incarnation, or they just read these stories Christologically. Like, they thought of Jesus as being the one who's wrestling with Jacob, and it becomes Jacob is kind of the heir of the revelation generation, centuries, 1,000 years before anybody else. And Christians, I don't know if I like that idea anymore. I like the idea that what Jesus was, who Jesus was, is God incarnate, and that God's incarnations are always like, I like the idea that it's both different. It is Jesus, but it's not necessarily Jesus, the person we would have seen if we were walking around first century Palestine, but the idea that it's the Logos. We talked about the Logos, right, in our John 1 episode, that this is the ordering principle of the universe in flesh.
Yeah, and in John, the
bunch.
Logos existed before the incarnation, right?
Yeah.
The Word, which was there in the beginning, becomes flesh later. It's And then they're like, well, no, actually, no, that because Jesus was back there wrestling Jacob. So
So who do you think he's wrestling
I'm
with?
deeply skeptical of all this. I just want you to know that. Like, I mean, with respect,
I am
with
too.
respect to the church fathers and all this, oh boy, that'd be mighty convenient, wouldn't it? If now, as we're trying to justify this new faith and we're trying to look for any evidence we can that this guy that we claim is God, and I do believe he's God, to be clear. But it's awfully convenient that now we can go back and find all the, no pun intended, Easter eggs where he was creeping in the background the whole time. Look, Christ, Logos. Okay, sure. But I think it was just a man. Like, for the sake of the story, for the sake of the telling of the tale, all right? In the absence of other stories involving river spirits and things like that, okay? At least in the Hebrew canon. They've got words for all kinds of stuff. And here they talk about a man. He wrestled a man, okay? I think it was a guy. I think this story exists.
That's what the story's supposed to mean.
To tell them something about the character of Jacob. And he just wrestled a dude. And he wrestled this guy who, and as a result, and maybe it was popularly understood that he had a limp, and this is where the limp came from. And then also, this is why we don't eat the thing, right?
Yeah.
And I think to inject God into it, I don't see that here.
But Jacob
Jacob does inject God. But what does that tell you about Jacob? Like, if the purpose of the story is to tell you something about Jacob, why are we insisting that we have to read it as revelation and not just that this man Jacob wrestled a guy in the night
and got
that
confused.
He couldn't beat, didn't get confused, declared that he had wrestled God? All right. You said yourself, Jacob is a guy who's striving for things. He's seeking blessing. He's deceitful. He's a man who is so enamored with his Do you hear where I'm going, though?
Yeah, I like this.
He's a man who is so enamored. Now, no, hear me out, because I'm going with a real place.
Okay.
Israel, all right, the cultural understanding of the people of Israel at this time. Yeah. What matters, the individual or the people?
The people.
The people. So what if you've got a guy, and he exists in the canon of your culture to demonstrate to you what happens when an individual is so high on their own supply, so fixated on their own role in the story, that they dupe their father and they dupe their brother, and that they're willing to send all of the things that should have belonged collectively to the people on out. He's willing to send his family and his children on ahead, so that if his brother was vengeful, they would have been killed first.
The worst freaking thing.
The worst freaking thing. And you've got this guy who then stays behind, wrestles a random guy, and then declares that he wrestled God. What if this story is about how Jacob had an inflated sense of himself and had lost the plot vis-a-vis God being for all the people, and instead was so fixated? So then we get the comedy of, he's got a hold of this guy in the dark, and this guy's so full of, give me another blessing, right? Doesn't that track with this character? So that's what I'm submitting is the thrust. I acknowledge that there are rich traditions in attempting to interpret the theological meaning of this passage, and maybe some or all of them are true too.
Okay, but here's the thing. The textual assumption of the story is that Jacob thinks that's God. That we can
That he says it.
Jacob says
this
it.
is a compelling point.
Okay, well, let's
All we have is Jacob's
we don't know
word
what
for it.
we don't know what he was thinking. He wasn't, but we do know that he declares, "I wrestle God here today."
Yes.
He does. He
And
absolutely-
I am only saying that maybe that is a construction of Jacob's own ego more than it is the compelling part of the story.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. I believe in very anthropological readings of these kind of stories. And rather than maybe Jacob wrestled God, maybe this story's function in the society of the Hebrew people was to show them what happens when you become so fixated on yourself that you cease to think of yourself as one of the people. You become someone who,
Sort of like Jim Jones, right?
I mean, maybe
mean,
in a
not-
less nefarious
Right,
way,
right, yeah.
But you become someone who believes he could wrestle God
Yeah.
because you believe you are the point.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
I like this.
Yeah.
I think it's a compelling reading of the story. I will say I don't think that's how anyone else has read it in either the Jewish or the Christian traditions.
But
This reading is not well attested.
and I will fully acknowledge that. Okay.
But it's sort of, it does kind of
it's
jive. I mean,
great.
I like it.
All I'm saying is, if you took it, and this is what this project is about, right? This
Absolutely,
podcast,
yes.
right? Is we're going to step away
It's
from the religious traditions that have interpreted this text.
Yeah.
If you found this in the milieu of any other culture, and you knew that culture had an overriding perspective that it was about the collective people, and you had this story, I don't think you'd read it in the ways that our religious traditions have read it. So that's why I'm submitting to you that maybe there are dimensions beyond that.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful.
That's what I'm standing on.
I'm incredibly grateful for that.
And these are ancient stories, and they were told for different reasons, actually, too. And there are probably variations of this story
absolutely,
that we
yeah.
don't have. Yeah.
And this doesn't get nearly enough attention in the traditions, but some like more recent interpreters have absolutely noticed, and maybe people have noticed this all along too, but they're not. These readings aren't really common. Jacob he sends everybody else across the river, and then he goes back.
Yeah.
If Esau comes, and Esau is angry, so the whole idea is Jacob's coming back to town. He's worried that Esau is still holding a grudge. He hears Esau's coming to meet him with an army, because these are all rich people, and he thinks Esau's coming to kill him. So he sends all these gifts, one, and then he sends his family across the river. Now, it's hard to parse the geography. Like, scholars have spent years and words and energy and sweat and blood trying to figure out exactly what's going on geographically. But the best reading is probably that Jacob is in the safest place
So he can run away.
out
Run
of
away,
anyone in his camp. So his 12 kids, his wives, all the people who depend on them, if Esau shows up to kill people, they're going to die first, and Jacob has a chance to get away, which is morally reprehensible.
Which is why he needs an extra blessing.
Well, he needs something. I mean, there's a reading here, like, if it's God,
yeah.
that's why God shows up to kick his butt.
Get back over there.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But it is, I mean, the one question I would have, Jacob's character changes in this moment, or seems to change in this moment. Jacob, after this story, is more passive, but also nicer. Like, something has happened here that matters for his character in the narrative.
Yeah.
And that is a common interpretation. I don't know if you can say interpretation, but this is a fulcrum point, a swing for Jacob, a moral shift in him or something.
Is it a crazier story if it's just a random guy? So there's also, like, this story doesn't say clearly, like, it's not spelled out. There aren't footnotes that say, like, this story is meant to be read literally. Like, it happens in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
It's dreamlike.
Sure.
Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
there's the metaphorical reading is really well attested that no, obviously Jacob's not wrestling with God.
Yeah. It was another
physically
vision of
in a
sorts.
body.
Like he's had before.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
is a spiritual
Mhm.
experience. It's an allegorical story of
Yeah,
Jacob.
sure.
Got his
wrestling.
ladder, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Jacob's seen this stuff. This chapter starts with Jacob sets up camp here because he thinks this is where God likes to hang out.
Mm-hmm.
Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. When Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." And that's where they start.
Okay, so Jacob could recognize angels,
Yeah, Jacob. We have stories about
but he
Jacob.
didn't know. But this dude here, Jacob didn't think this was an angel.
No, Jacob. Well, I don't
Right,
know.
yeah. He
I don't
could
know what
discern
Jacob
an
thought.
angel from a dude, right?
Apparently.
Mhm.
Hear me out.
Yeah.
What if, in wrestling with this person and having
Uh-huh.
this declaration made over him about you are someone who's wrestled with God and human beings,
Yeah.
what if Jacob comes to the realization of his own, I'm the problem? That's the pivot point, right? What
Yeah.
if we see wrestling with God and like we think of it almost as triumphant, but he's oh wait, I'm the problem. I've been the one who's caused all this turmoil by behaving in the way that I behave, right? And that's the character change.
I do think it's that kind of. It appears to me to
Right.
be that kind of story.
An awakening of sorts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the metaphor of wrestling with God is a really powerful one.
Sure.
Like that's what I like about this story.
Yeah.
Is, that it's hard. It's painful. You have to wrestle, and it lasts.
Well, and this
all night.
idea of wrestling with God, arguing with God, disagreeing with God, that's so Jewish. And actually, it's so absent, I think, in the Christian tradition. It's almost like we're afraid to question.
Yeah.
And for me, it's one of the goals of the podcast is, it is okay
Yeah.
to wrestle with this, to wrestle with the scripture, to wrestle with God, to question, to argue, to even be angry. And that,
And to say that this is an idea that's like more firmly rooted in the Jewish tradition. Are you thinking especially of this story? Are you thinking of like the Psalms of Lament? Because I think there's strands in the Jewish faith where this is no more acceptable than it is for some strands in the.
Well, I remember
Christian faith.
I can't remember if this is factual or if it's a story, but the Jews put God on trial during the Holocaust. I don't know if there was a movie about it. Is God guilty of did God allow this to happen? Which is so Jewish. You can argue, you can assert yourself. Moses, there's a story in Exodus where at least the Hebrew word is Moses gets God to repent, God to change God's mind.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I think those stories are there. I think this is a thing that religious faith in general, like there's always a strand that wants to encourage it and always a strand that resists it. And a lot of the readings you do hear of this story, like even people who think Jacob is wrestling with God, they always point to the moment when the hip socket, like it says, like they've fought to a draw, like neither of them can prevail over the other one, and then the stranger touches the hip and Jacob is left with a limp for the rest of his life. And people have read that and said, see, God could have won any time. So God will, there's this reading of the story that God will let you wrestle up to a point, and then when God loses patience, you better watch out.
Yeah.
Which is not a reading I especially appreciate.
No.
I kind of like the idea that Jacob wrestles God to a draw.
We could see there'd be some utility to that reading, right? If you were trying to get a certain lesson or a point across, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's borne out here. Yeah. But then again, I came out of right field today too, so who am I to judge? But
I'm so happy you did.
Yeah, I like it. Listen, I stand right. I will stand by that.
When you read this, do you, what do you expect? I know you've read this now, but imagine like reading it for the first time. What are you expecting when when we get the word that Esau's coming with 400 men?
Well, just the whole setup. I mean, what's happened before? If you're just reading it cold, it sure sounds like it's going to end badly for Jacob.
Yeah.
I mean, and it sure seems very logical that Jacob would be scared to death and would try to come up with every way possible to avoid that confrontation.
Yeah.
That there's vengeance, right? There's maybe even justice coming for him because he's the bad guy.
He has been.
I mean, he really is.
I mean, I like him.
Mhm.
I like him the whole time. Like, I never turn on Jacob in this whole story because I think he's cool.
Okay. He's cool like Loki's cool.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
He's a tricky guy.
There's place for a trickster in a lot of folklore, right? And a lot of cultural mythology. Tricksters keep things from being stagnant.
Yeah.
You know, is Jacob a trickster character at the start of this narrative? I think you could make a pretty good case that he is.
Yeah. And then God makes him boring.
God makes him, he breaks his hip and makes him boring. Yeah.
Which God does to a lot of people.
Out there suplexing people into submission. No, I think, there'd be, I mean, you asked the question, what do you expect? You expect vengeance, right? You expect, okay, Esau is going to show up
With 400 soldiers.
With 400 soldiers ready to kick butt or whatever the appropriate term would be at that time. And, you know, ultimately, narratively, we know that there's a surprise, something else happens, right? But with everything Jacob has done, both here and then with his other family, his time acquiring his wives and his goods, you think this guy's finally going to get what's coming to him.
Yeah. And probably that's what I marvel about. That might be one of the things I like best about this chapter of the Bible is I think it's one of the best constructed narratives. Like it works as a story on all these levels because you know who these people are. You do kind of understand their history. It's the kind of human drama that people tend to relate to. And you've got this tension building up where Esau's on the way and he's got an army with him. Jacob is like sending gifts and putting his family in harm's way. And then the tension like ratchets up into this full night long wrestling match. I just think it's amazing. And then the sun is
Verse
coming
7,
up.
he says,
It's
Jacob
cinematic.
was greatly afraid and distressed. So clearly he didn't think things were going to work out real well.
Yeah, Jacob definitely thinks Esau is coming to kill everyone.
Yeah.
I'm still stuck on whether this is God or not. Not that I have an answer, but I just think that's like, I think that's probably one of the questions a lot of our audience is like, how do you deal with a passage like this that's like, seems so bizarre, so crazy? Why is it even in there?
It is crazy. Like the whole book is wild. And this story for me is kind of the high point. I think one of the weirdest things in a really weird book.
Yeah. Sorry. You think this one's one of the weirdest ones?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Would you say not?
No. Like, I think this is on the tame because again, I do not hold with the idea that he wrestled God literally. I don't even think it's a figurative vision of him wrestling.
It's
with God.
insane even for him to say that.
No, I think he just, and again, I don't think it's anyway. All right. All that said, I think there are wilder things in Genesis. That's all I'm saying. I think there are crazier things in the Bible. I think this is on the tame end of the scale. All right.
Yeah.
And I mean, even you hold it up against the bears and Elisha, right? Like that's the watermark for the weirdest thing in the Bible.
Oh, you
I didn't know if you
I
meant
don't
book of
think
Genesis or
so.
book of Bible, right? I wasn't sure what you meant.
Yeah.
In the book of Genesis,
I was thinking of Genesis.
there's a tower where God tells them not to speak the same, like he makes it so they can't understand each other anymore.
That would be in my top 5.
It's a weirder one. I'm saying it. I'm just, I don't know. This one's not so weird.
People wonder, so what Jacob actually says after the wrestling match, and there he gets the blessing he asked for. Jacob names the place Peniel, saying, "For here I have seen God face to face,
Yep.
yet my life is preserved." Which I think is one of the first references in the Bible to the idea that you can't see God without dying. Like that idea keeps coming up through the Old Testament, but it's like one of the first rules we hear is that if you see God, you're going to die.
Yeah.
Which is why people
So
have argued for years about,
Uh-huh.
well, did he wrestle with God or not?
Maybe he didn't. I don't know.
But other people see God without dying too.
Mm-hmm.
Like whose rule? I want to know whose rule that is. Who says you can't see God?
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? Is this a rule you accept?
Oh, boy, it sounds so. I can imagine some of the early church fathers like stressing that God is so holy, this, and then we get to the whole sacrificial atonement thing. God, you can't even be in God's presence, or you'll spontaneously combust. I mean, those ideas are very religious ideas, but Genesis
But it
isn't
comes
really
out
a religious document. I mean, it doesn't feel religious.
Like it comes out of nowhere here. This is the first suggestion that you can't see God without dying, isn't it?
Or are you reading that back into it?
Jacob
that's what I
seems
meant.
to think.
Does
Yeah,
he?
that's a good question.
Okay, I'm sorry,
Okay.
but does he? Because
Yeah.
again, this is he is just saying, all he said is, "For I have seen God face to face, yet my life is preserved." Now, is the implication there that God is powerful and any interaction with God is risky, right? Which seems fair.
Yeah.
Or is the implication there the looking upon him should have killed me?
I think I don't see it made like those two statements don't feel that different to me.
They don't feel that different.
No.
So
Like if God is so powerful that any interaction is risky, like that's the same.
maybe let me think of how to articulate that differently. Okay. So nowhere does Jacob say normally people die when they look at him. I didn't die. That's wild, right? Okay. Are we putting that into this? That notion, right? Or are we putting that into this when that would not necessarily have been a hard and fast rule? And is it a rule even that you can't? Or is it just that there are circumstances in which, because of how God orients and arranges things, if you interact with this or with me in these places in this way, you die? Is it ever explicitly stated that if you look at God, you'll die? Or is it just situationally sometimes you die when you look at God?
I don't think
you understand what I'm saying?
Consistently applied.
Yeah, okay.
But I do think at some point in the tradition, you have like a pretty clearly formulated idea that God's glory is such that you can't look on it without.
But you've got Isaiah who I'm a dead man, right?
Yeah, well,
but he isn't a dead man.
Yeah.
The rule gets broken
all the time, actually.
A few times.
I wouldn't call it a rule, is all I'm saying. Like, all I'm saying is it a rule?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
It's a human misconception.
Like, that was the question, right? You said,
I don't think you can see God, so I don't think the point is null and void. Like,
what does it mean to see God? I see him in you guys right
now. So here's a
see him in
question.
That's chapter 33.
Yeah.
So verse 30, I've seen God face to face, yet my life is preserved.
Mm-hmm.
The Hebrew is Saul, which it's more like to be rescued, to be saved from peril or danger. It's that has a different flavor to me than my life was preserved.
Mm-hmm.
It's like somebody rescued him from this situation, or, I saw God face to face, and I don't know. It's a weird sentence, actually, as to what's going on here.
It is weird. You're not convinced.
Look, I've made my point. Like I've made it clear where I'm at.
It's great. I think narratively, there's at least the suggestion that I think the narrative thinks Jacob is wrestling with something divine or semi-divine. In the final version of the story that actually gets passed down. How the story evolved along the way, I don't. Yeah.
And when you get to the temple, imagine. God has to be that way, or the temple doesn't work, right? God is so holy in the Holy of Holies.
This rule about God,
and
about not
so
looking on God.
Because God is so holy, we need to sacrifice to appease God. You need for God to be that way for the whole temple system to be sustained.
Yeah, I think Josiah's question is a fair one. Like, is this statement from Jacob on its own, if I hadn't also read these other stories from the Bible where it's more clearly articulated. Like I think in Exodus, God says, "No one can look on my glory and live." I think that's a direct quote from God in the book of Exodus, which feels like a rule that God is invoking.
Listen, why do we have to make it... Why can't it just be right now? No one can look
at it right now.
Like, no, but here's what I'm saying. You were talking about
you couldn't look on it right now.
You can't look on it right now, Moses.
Yeah.
Because of what I'm doing, how I'm self-revealing in this moment. You cannot look on me, right? Not always. And to go to your point about the temple system, why can't it be I, God, have arranged this thing? And because this whole thing is trying to be a lesson in faithfulness so that we can demonstrate as a people to the rest of the world, why can't it be that right here, right now in the temple, not some innate thing about God that he cannot change, that he can't be looked upon? Why can't it be just for this moment in the experiment, you can't look at me? Because I want to see what happens with these people when their lives are on the line if they don't do this thing right. Will they then understand? Will they then put the effort into it that I hope they do? Or will they continue to even just die just for the sake of not doing the thing I'm asking them to do?
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? Like, as a distinction?
I hear what you're saying. I don't think that's how most people, like, I would say, Josiah, that's a creative reading of these ancient texts. It sounds like you've got a healthy relationship to your religion and to God. I think this is a conversation that's evolving within the Old Testament and the New Testament. Yeah. And I think a lot of the Old Testament writers think that it's a rule that you can't look at God without dying.
Except for when you don't die.
Yeah, but it's always an exception to the rule.
But there's so many exceptions.
That's what I'm saying.
There wouldn't be a story.
There's a point at which
why would you keep the other stories?
If you have too many exceptions, the rule's invalid. I mean, it's pointless.
Why does it have to be a rule? That's all I'm saying, is why does it have to be a rule?
I don't think it has to be a rule. Yeah. I think the Bible treats it like a rule.
But
that is constantly being violated.
Right. So at what point do we stop saying you can't look at God and we start saying you can look at God when he lets you and you don't look at God when he doesn't let you? And that's a different articulation.
Today you can't look at me.
And I think you could make a case that's the rule the Old Testament as a whole offers.
Yeah.
That maybe you can look at God. Maybe you can wrestle with God.
Yeah. Maybe.
If God wants.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't think any of the Old Testament writers, whoever they were, could have articulated it that clearly. I think these stories suggest a people who are wrestling with the idea that God should not be the kind of thing you can wrestle with.
God is always talking to these people. I mean, like sit-down conversations.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So they all just keep their eyes closed? Did Abraham keep his eyes closed when God was talking to him?
God came to Abraham as a smoking meat pot, if I remember correctly.
Well, that's not when he's on the hill overlooking Sodom and
But how do you know if you
or-
can't
At the
look?
Oaks
If you
of
can't look
Mamre.
at God, how did he know
Yeah.
it was a smoking meat pot?
You can look at that version.
You can look at the meat pot. You can look at the guy Jacob's wrestling. You can look at God when he's in a bush, but you can't look at him.
But one thing you do know, there's not that muscle in that meat pot, right?
Yeah. You know for a fact there's no muscle in that meat pot.
That was before the wrestling match.
Oh.
So you could still eat it then,
Maybe.
I think.
Yeah.
Last thing.
These questions, I don't think folks in these ancient times even asked those questions.
You don't?
I don't think those stories
Yes,
raised those
they
questions.
did.
I think they
Yeah.
absolutely. There was some kid, just like you and I, sat in our little fundy churches, and we said, "What about the dinosaur bones?" There was some kid down there sitting around the fire that said, "Hang on,
Was that really God?
look at
look at
God,
God."
though." Do you know what I mean? They're like, was it God? And maybe the answer varied depending upon what the storyteller was trying to answer. Now I hear you. You made a very salient point, and I want to acknowledge it. That the tradition, the thing that we have been handed down, clearly implies God was here. All right, I think it's at least was Jacob's perception.
I like that way of saying
Yeah,
it. It clearly implies God was there.
Yeah. And I want to acknowledge
Which-
that. At least
how?
Jacob
Yeah.
perceived in some way that he, like, in my poking at this and in my trying to read it outside of the narratives we've inherited about it, I want to bring that. But you're right. Okay. The interpretive tradition overwhelmingly suggests there was a divine encounter of some kind here. Is there more to it if we jettison that for a while? That's just when I ask, can we gain something from it if we jettison that idea? And aren't we allowed to jettison that idea?
Well, that's what rabbis did all the
Absolutely.
time, right?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's many rabbis, there are many opinions as there are rabbis. And the rabbis would debate and come up with different theories, crazy theories. I mean, there were some out there rabbis.
Anything else you guys want to talk about before we wrap?
Thanks for having me. This was fun. I like playing in this sandbox.
Yeah. It's been really fun. I appreciate it. You came way out of left field, and I will never think about this story the same way again. I think that's the best reading I've ever heard.
Good.
Yeah. I think that about does it.
Yeah.
A huge thank you, as always, to Nick Mandog Smith for producing and editing this show. Thank you to our executive producer, Jay Kennedy. Thanks, Josiah, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
It's been wonderful.
It was fun.
I always want to say thank you to my congregation here at First Baptist Church of Indianapolis, where I serve as one of the pastors. Scott, any final thoughts?
No, I think that wraps it up for me.
Josiah, anything you have to plug?
No. No.
Where can people find you?
Nowhere. You can't find me anywhere.
Yeah.
No, I am
Good
not.
job.
I have no public presence, and I'm enjoying that in this season of life.
Very nice.
Yep.
And of course, we do want to say thank you to all of you, our listeners. Thank you for joining us. Please do remember to rate and review or subscribe. You can find us on Instagram at the Unholy Bible Study. And you can email us at unholybiblestudypodcast@gmail.com, especially if you have questions about the Bible or about this show, or if there's something from the Bible that you'd like for us to talk about on a future episode. We would love to hear from you.
Do you have snail mail? Can they mail you something?
Nope.
Okay, good.
Only electronically.
Okay.
I'm not sure what we're talking about in our next episode, so we can't even preview it. Oh, yes, I do. Yes, I do. No. Yes, I am. I am sure what we're talking about. We're going to clean this up, Nick. Hope you'll join us.
Leave this. You don't clean it up.
Join us next week. We will be talking about Judges chapter 4. We're excited about that conversation. It is almost as crazy as this story. Yeah.
Oh, it's got a lot of crazy stories. Judges does.
Yeah. And that's a good one.
Mhm.
That's favorite might not be quite the right word, but I'm looking forward to the conversation. Should be good. I think that does it. For now, we're probably going to keep talking about this stuff, but you don't have to keep listening.
And you shouldn't.